Introduction. Whether one is overflowing with youthful ambition, newly tasting the rewards of elite status, reeling from an unexpected firing, or discovering the hollow isolation at the peak of achievement, a silent adversary is already present. The natural inclination is to deny this, assuming that extreme self-obsession is a flaw belonging exclusively to others. Yet the very traits that propel brilliant thinkers, relentless doers, and visionary creatives toward the pinnacle of their fields also expose them to a distinct and dangerous shadow of the human psyche. The adversary in question is not defined by clinical psychology or complex Freudian allegories where the rational mind attempts to steer the animalistic drives of the unconscious. Instead, it is understood through a much more common and insidious lens, a toxic, inflated belief in one's own supreme importance. It manifests as the petulant, demanding child within, prioritizing personal desires above all reality. It is the desperate hunger to be recognized as superior, expanding far past the boundaries of actual utility or earned confidence. When self-assurance mutates into reckless abandon and assertiveness calcifies into blind obstinacy, the world is perceived through a distorted, self-serving lens. This gravitational pull drags down ultimate potential, acting as the absolute destroyer of what one hopes to build and what one has already secured. True creative insight, collaborative harmony, lasting loyalty, and the ability to replicate success are all actively repelled by it. It functions as a perilous trap, similar to the mythical Scylla and Charybdis, attracting catastrophic errors and unnecessary enemies. Despite this, the root cause of these relentless obstacles remains unacknowledged. It is far easier to place the blame on external forces or other people rather than looking inward. The ancient poet Lucretius perfectly described this condition as a sick man who remains completely ignorant of the true source of his illness. The destruction operates much like a progressive disease. A pioneering executive once likened this egotism to alcoholism, noting that the afflicted individual does not stumble clumsily, but rather grows increasingly arrogant, a symptom tragically mistaken by both the victim and onlookers as genuine power and confidence. It is fundamentally defined as a conscious separation from everything that matters. Walls are erected that block teamwork, deafen the ears to critical feedback, and blind the eyes to genuine opportunities, replacing the physical world with a comforting fantasy. Without an objective measure of personal ability, confidence decays into pure delusion, making it impossible to lead or empathize with others. As performance artist Marina Abramović observed, embracing the illusion of personal greatness is the ultimate death of creativity. Doing great work requires stepping into terror, and this toxic vanity acts as a soothing, short-term salve for deep-seated insecurities, whispering exactly what the frightened mind wants to hear. Modern culture serves as an accelerant for this fire. Technology has constructed platforms specifically designed to amplify self-promotion, allowing anyone to broadcast their intentions, invent grandiose titles, and revel in the immediate validation of followers. The narrative of the solitary, risk-taking genius is relentlessly idolized, urging society to dare greatly and assume a bold swagger. However, this is a dangerous misinterpretation that confuses the loud symptoms of success with the actual quiet causes of it. While history certainly features famously egotistical figures, an honest accounting reveals that far more lives were ruined by this gamble than were saved by it. At any moment, an individual exists within one of three fluid states: aspiring to make a mark, navigating the complexities of achievement, or enduring the crushing weight of failure. This internal enemy is present at every single stage, threatening the processes of building, maintaining, and recovering. The objective is not to extinguish uniqueness or the drive to push boundaries, but to cultivate a necessary balance. As William Penn noted, structures left exposed to harsh elements require an incredibly strong foundation. The antidote involves suppressing toxic pride early in the journey, replacing its temptations with strict discipline during periods of prosperity, and forging resilient strength to survive the inevitable crashes. The optimistic truth is that this darker impulse can be managed and directed. By studying historical figures who integrated baseball, revolutionized military strategy, and stood against tyranny, a clear pattern emerges. Their monumental achievements in art, business, and leadership were rooted in an unflinching connection to reality, functioning like a spider highly attuned to its web. They were not entirely devoid of vanity, but they possessed the profound ability to subsume and channel it when the stakes were highest, remaining great yet fiercely humble. It is tempting to point to notorious outliers, famous innovators, or artists known for their immense vanity to rationalize bad behavior. Yet a closer examination reveals that their success did not spring from their delusions or their disconnectedness. Often their most brilliant work occurred in the rare moments when they actively fought back against those very flaws and addictions. When artifice and swagger are stripped away, what remains is rock hard, earned confidence. The difference between the two is the difference between medicine and poison. One path leads to the creation of lasting empires and profound artistic legacies. The other plunges into the dark waters of scandal, bankruptcy, and historical infamy. Some learn to anchor themselves in reality, while others hand their hard-won victories back to the world. The question of which path to walk is unavoidable. Chapter 1. Aspire. At the very beginning of any great endeavor, an individual possesses a clear goal, a profound calling, or a fresh starting point. It is the origin of every monumental journey, yet an alarming number of ambitious people never arrive at their intended destination. The primary culprit behind this failure is almost always an inflated sense of self. During this early phase, individuals construct fantastical narratives about their own destiny, acting as if they possess all the answers, allowing their initial spark to burn with intense, unsustainable heat until it completely fizzles out. These are the distinct symptoms of a dangerous psychological affliction, one that can only be cured through a strict regimen of humility and a firm grounding in reality. As the philosopher Adam Smith observed, while it takes a bold surgeon to operate on their own body, it requires equal courage to strip away the mysterious veil of self-delusion and squarely face the deformities of one's own conduct. This pursuit of self-awareness has ancient roots, perfectly illustrated in a letter written around 374 BC by the prominent Athenian teacher Isocrates to a young, ambitious man named Demonicus. Having been a friend of the boy's recently deceased father, Isocrates sought to impart noble maxims and practical moral precepts to guide the young man's dangerous path of ambition. He warned Demonicus to practice strict self-control, avoiding the sway of temper, pleasure, and pain, while deeply abhorring flatterers who inherently injure those who trust them. The teacher emphasized the importance of remaining affable, never haughty, and advised being slow in deliberation but incredibly prompt in execution. This exact advice echoed through the centuries, eventually shaping the words of William Shakespeare, who placed a nearly identical speech in the mouth of Polonius as he advised his son Laertes in the play Hamlet, famously concluding with the directive to be true to oneself. Centuries later, Shakespeare's timeless warning deeply resonated with a young military officer named William Tecumseh Sherman, a man who, much like Demonicus, had lost his father at a young age and was raised by a wise older mentor, Thomas Ewing. Sherman would eventually become one of America's most brilliant strategic minds, but his early trajectory offered absolutely no indication of such monumental, history-altering success. Unlike conquerors who burst onto the scene in a flash of unearned glory, Sherman's rise was remarkably gradual, marked by years of slow, deliberate learning as he traversed the United States on horseback during various military postings. When the Civil War erupted, he fought at the disastrous Battle of Bull Run and was subsequently promoted to brigadier general due to a severe shortage of leadership. However, when summoned to meet with President Lincoln, Sherman made an incredibly unusual request. He accepted his promotion only under the strict guarantee that he would not be forced to assume superior command. Possessing an honest, uninflated appraisal of his own capabilities, he actively chose to remain a subordinate until he genuinely felt ready for the crushing weight of ultimate responsibility. Sherman was not entirely immune to the manic pressures of leadership, as evidenced early in the war when tasked with defending Kentucky with insufficient resources. Overwhelmed by paranoia and self-doubt, he spoke injudiciously to the press, resulting in a temporary recall from his command to recover from the severe mental strain. Yet, he learned profoundly from this near-catastrophic stumble. Later, at the siege of Fort Donelson, despite holding a senior rank to General Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman completely waived his authority, choosing to cheerfully support and reinforce Grant rather than engaging in the toxic political infighting that consumed other generals. This deliberate subjugation of personal pride directly contributed to one of the Union's first major victories, when he finally launched his famous march to the sea. It was not an act of spontaneous, egotistical genius, but a deeply calculated strategy relying on the exact topographical knowledge he had meticulously gathered during his obscure early postings. His supreme realism allowed him to ignore baiting criticism and deliberately avoid pitched frontal assaults, carving an impossible path through the South that a more vain commander would have surely turned into a bloody disaster. By the war's conclusion, Sherman was immensely famous, yet he entirely shunned the spotlight, possessing zero taste for political office or the relentless flattery of the public. He famously warned his friend Grant to treat such glittering praise as nothing more than a passing summer breeze. A biographer perfectly captured Sherman's essence, noting that while some leaders are born with an unearned, blind belief in themselves, others experience a slow, cautious growth of confidence strictly dependent on actual achievement. This second type of person remains inherently modest, possessing true poise rather than a dramatic pose, fully recognizing the difference between authentic ability and delusional fantasy. This model of quiet, unglamorous realism stands in stark contrast to modern cultural values, which actively train individuals to rely on external validation and unchecked emotion. Entire generations have been raised with an artificial emphasis on self-esteem, repeatedly assured that raw talent and a belief in oneself are sufficient to conquer any obstacle. In truth, this constant encouragement only fosters weakness, blinding individuals to the reality that talent is merely the starting line. The ultimate test is whether one can accurately evaluate their own abilities without succumbing to the fatal arrogance that halts all genuine improvement. It is a rare trait to cultivate the detachment necessary to view one's own work objectively, completely removing the emotional infatuation that clouds the minds of narcissistic strivers. To ensure that one's work possesses enduring truth, the ambition behind it cannot be grandiose. It must be iterative, built patiently through action and continuous education. While aggressive competitors sabotage their own sanity through endless self-promotion and intensity, the aspiring master focuses relentlessly on the long term by actively challenging the toxic myth of the tortured, self-assured genius and choosing to live small in order to think big. A deeply connected and aware foundation is built. As Winston Churchill noted, facts are infinitely superior to dreams. By understanding that this inner enemy must be suppressed early on the journey, any eventual success achieved will serve to strengthen, rather than sink, the individual who earned it. Chapter 2. Success. At the absolute summit of any great endeavor, having scaled the mountain and achieved what we once only dreamed of, the air becomes dangerously thin. It is here, in this unforgiving and elevated environment, that we face an entirely new set of temptations and treacherous psychological traps. We frequently wonder why success so often proves to be painfully ephemeral. The uncomfortable truth is that ego artificially shortens the lifespan of our victories. Whether the collapse arrives in a dramatic, catastrophic implosion or through a slow, agonizing erosion of principles, it is almost always driven by an internal rot. Having arrived, we suddenly cease to do the very things that brought us there. We stop listening. We lose our appetite for learning. And we completely lose our grasp on the foundational metrics of what actually matters. Consider the ultimate cautionary tale of Howard Hughes. Inheriting the keys to a massively profitable tool company at the tender age of 18, he possessed the rare audacity to immediately buy out his relatives and consolidate total control. It was a move of apparent visionary brilliance. Yet, what followed was a decades-long chronicle of ego-driven devastation that stands as one of the most embarrassing business track records in modern history. He effectively abandoned the core enterprise that funded his life, treating it merely as a bottomless bank account to finance a series of increasingly erratic and disastrous obsessions. He hemorrhaged millions in the stock market, bled capital into indulgent and chaotic film projects, and ventured into defense, contracting only to produce the infamous Spruce Goose. an astronomical waste of time and taxpayer money that flew just a single time. Hughes was undeniably a mechanical genius and a man of immense personal bravery, yet he serves as a flesh-and-blood metaphor for the destructive power of ego. He worked furiously with one hand to build a legacy, while the other hand worked equally hard to sabotage it through paranoia, self-indulgence, and a total detachment from reality. Despite the romanticized cultural mythology that sometimes paints him as a bold maverick, he died a miserable, isolated man, trapped in a prison of his own delusions, having squandered an incomprehensible amount of talent and wealth. This is the ultimate danger of unchecked achievement. The pioneering corporate executive Harold Janine accurately diagnosed this phenomenon when he observed that the worst disease afflicting successful leaders is not alcoholism, but egotism. It is a sickness that blinds men and women to reality, isolating them in a fabricated universe where they genuinely believe they can do no wrong. To survive the summit, one must actively cultivate profound sobriety, strict open-mindedness, and rigorous organization. These virtues are the only reliable counterweights to the intoxicating, destructive effects of accomplishment. Always stay a student. The historical perception of Genghis Khan is almost universally reduced to that of a bloodthirsty, savage conqueror who swept across the steppes to terrorize the civilized world. Yet an honest and objective examination of his life reveals a remarkably different reality. His unprecedented supremacy was forged because he was, above all else, a relentless, lifelong student. His empire did not expand solely through brute force, but through a unique and disciplined willingness to absorb the best technologies, practices, and innovations of every single culture he encountered. His earliest military advancements came from observing and appropriating the decimal-based organizational structures of neighboring Turkic tribes. When his cavalry later collided with the seemingly impenetrable walled cities of the Tangut, he did not stubbornly rely on traditional tactics. He humbly learned the complex art of siege warfare, eventually utilizing foreign engineers to construct machines capable of shattering ancient fortifications. Recognizing that enduring power required more than just martial dominance, he systematically enlisted the brightest minds: astrologers, scholars, doctors, and philosophers from the lands he vanquished. The Mongol Empire thrived not through original technological invention, but through the deliberate, open-minded fusion of diverse global knowledge, combining elements like Chinese gunpowder and European metallurgy to revolutionize warfare. This phenomenal expansion was entirely dependent on a supreme humility, a constant willingness to admit ignorance in the face of the unknown. As success propels any individual into unfamiliar territory, a brilliant programmer forced to become a manager or a localized success suddenly thrust onto a global stage, the shores of their ignorance expand simultaneously with their island of knowledge. The profound temptation is to project a facade of complete mastery, allowing ego to convince us that our past victories guarantee our future comprehension. The legendary jazz musician Wynton Marsalis identified this exact psychological trap, observing that true humility is the absolute prerequisite for learning. It is the only force that can beat back the blinding arrogance of assuming we already know the way. The very second the ego declares that our education is complete, our intellectual and creative death begins. To combat this creeping obsolescence, we must systematically seek out situations that induce the deeply uncomfortable realization of our own ignorance. We must deliberately pick up texts on subjects we know nothing about. We must force ourselves into rooms where we are unequivocally the least knowledgeable participant. The catastrophic failure of massive, dominant corporations in the face of industry disruption is almost always a failure to remain students. As the management thinker Peter Drucker emphasized, the mere desire to learn is radically insufficient. We must actively engineer systems and processes that facilitate our own continuous, lifelong education. Don't tell yourself a story. When Bill Walsh assumed command of the San Francisco 49ers in 1979, the franchise was widely considered the most dysfunctional and defeated organization in professional sports. Within a staggering 3 years, he orchestrated a miraculous turnaround, culminating in a Super Bowl victory. Looking back from the glittering pinnacle of that achievement, it would have been incredibly easy and universally accepted for Walsh to craft a triumphant narrative. He could have claimed that this rapid ascent was the flawless execution of a grand, visionary master plan, but Walsh fiercely refused to indulge in this seductive fiction. He explicitly denied ever having a predetermined timetable for championship glory, understanding perfectly well that such grandiose projections, especially when inheriting a shattered organization, are the purest hallmark of ego and delusion. Instead of fixating on a distant, heroic outcome, Walsh focused obsessively on the immediate, relentless implementation of what he called his standard of performance. He directed all his organizational energy toward the execution of seemingly mundane, microscopic details, the exact inch of a passing route, the impeccable cleanliness of the locker room, the strict professional attire of his coaching staff. He operated under the unshakable belief that if the organization pursued uncompromising excellence in these daily actions, the ultimate score on the board would take care of itself. The human mind possesses a dangerous, innate impulse to retroactively weave messy, unpredictable realities into neat, heroic mythologies. We look at an unlikely triumph and convince ourselves that it was destined, that our sheer, unadulterated genius foresaw every obstacle and perfectly calculated every maneuver. This storytelling breeds a toxic arrogance. It transforms dynamic, hard-working individuals into static caricatures of greatness, blinding them to the actual gritty mechanisms of their own success. Walsh's players rapidly demonstrated the peril of this post-victory mythology, infected by the belief in their own inherent specialness following their first championship. Their discipline severely eroded, resulting in a disastrous slump. Only by completely abandoning their self-congratulatory storyline and aggressively recommitting to the unglamorous standard of performance did they manage to right the ship and build a lasting dynasty. Pioneers across all fields echo this absolute necessity for anti-narrative realism. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos routinely dispels the myth of the sudden, brilliant aha moment, acknowledging the chaotic, iterative, and deeply messy reality of building his empire. Investors who guide the world's most innovative startups explicitly warn against adopting frighteningly massive visions in the early stages, advising instead to focus on deceptively small, practical problems. When we accept the label of genius or begin to view our trajectory as an inevitable destiny, much like Napoleon, who fatally engraved "to destiny" on his wedding ring before overreaching his way into infamous exile, we place our future in grave peril. Enduring success is never a compelling story written in hindsight. It is the unromantic byproduct of sustained effort, continuous adaptation, and an unwavering grip on reality. What's important to you? In the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman stood side by side as the two most revered and powerful figures in the nation. Given absolute freedom by a grateful country to dictate the remainder of their lives, they chose radically diverging paths, illustrating a profound lesson in self-awareness. Sherman, fiercely protective of his internal compass and harboring a deep revulsion for the chaotic machinations of politics, firmly declined all entreaties to run for public office. Completely satisfied with the rank he had earned and the monumental tasks he had completed, he retired to a life of genuine, quiet contentment. Grant, however, despite possessing zero political acumen and having achieved his military brilliance precisely because of his straightforward, apolitical nature, succumbed to the intoxicating allure of the presidency. He was elected in a landslide, only to preside over a famously corrupt, contentious, and agonizingly ineffective administration. Upon finally leaving office, his relentless and unfocused ambition drove him to partner with a charismatic but fundamentally fraudulent investor, a disastrous decision that culminated in a spectacular and public bankruptcy. Exhausted, humiliated, and plagued by terminal throat cancer, Grant spent his final agonizing days in a desperate race to pen his memoirs, simply to save his family from absolute destitution. As Sherman astutely observed, with a mixture of sympathy and sorrow, his friend had been driven by an inexplicable, tragic desire to rival the wealth of millionaires, men who would have gladly traded their entire fortunes for even a fraction of Grant's historical glory. Grant's ultimate tragedy was his inability to accurately define what was actually important to his own soul. This is the insidious, creeping nature of ego in the wake of achievement. We secure the very things we originally sought, but quickly lose our bearings in the new, rarefied air. Surrounded by other highly successful individuals, ego breeds a toxic, comparative envy, constantly whispering that we must possess whatever they have, blinding us to the sheer absurdity of running a race we never intentionally entered. To combat this deeply destructive cycle, we must look to the ancient Greek concept of euthymia, the profound, unshakable tranquility that comes from knowing exactly what path we are on and remaining steadfastly upon it, completely undisturbed by the myriad of other glittering paths intersecting our own. It requires the incredibly difficult introspective work of identifying our absolute true purpose and, crucially, accepting the inherent trade-offs that follow. One cannot simultaneously pursue every available prize. Grand strategies and deep callings are almost always mutually exclusive. True independence is forged not by accumulating the most universal accolades, but by ruthlessly ignoring the distracting pace of others and resolutely defining the singular, meaningful race we are actually meant to run. Entitlement, control, and paranoia. When the Persian Emperor Xerxes initiated his massive invasion of Greece, he ordered his engineers to construct floating bridges across the Hellespont. Shortly after completion, the unpredictable waters surged and shattered the structures. Xerxes' reaction to this natural event was not that of a rational commander facing a logistical setback. Instead, he ordered his men to hurl heavy chains into the water, inflict 300 lashes upon the river itself, and sear it with red-hot irons. As this bizarre punishment was administered, his soldiers were instructed to verbally berate the body of water for injuring a master who had done it no wrong. To complete this display of supreme arrogance, Xerxes had the engineers who built the bridges beheaded. The ancient historian Herodotus categorized this behavior as presumptuous, but from a modern psychological standpoint, it was purely delusional. Xerxes had grown so intoxicated by his own supremacy that he genuinely believed he could command the elements. Before the river incident, he had even drafted a menacing letter to a mountain that stood in the path of a planned canal, threatening to topple its peaks into the sea if it dared to obstruct his will. While it is easy to mock such preposterous antics, Xerxes represents a timeless archetype. When individuals secure immense power or experience astronomical success, they often fall prey to a triad of cognitive distortions: entitlement, the compulsion to control, and paranoia. The poet William Blake warned that the deadliest poison known to man is derived from the victor's laurel crown. The danger stems from the very traits that fueled the initial ascent. Achieving greatness often requires an almost irrational force of will, a refusal to accept the odds, and a stubborn defiance of skeptics. Because this stubbornness worked once, the newly successful individual assumes it is a magic formula. They begin to believe that they bend reality to their whims. Consider the creator of the wildly successful Beanie Babies empire, who became so blinded by his own commercial invincibility that he confidently declared he could slap his company's logo on animal waste and it would sell. Ignoring the desperate warnings of his inner circle, he drove his enterprise into the ground and narrowly avoided prison. His absolute certainty had mutated into a fatal liability. Success brings immense pressure and unprecedented responsibilities, creating a psychological pressure cooker. Without extreme self-awareness, the very ambition that sparked the journey calcifies into a toxic entitlement. Entitlement boldly declares that the world owes us its unwavering compliance because of what we have achieved. It views the time and energy of others as entirely subservient to our own, leading to explosive tirades and impossible demands that exhaust our most valuable allies. Closely related is the obsession with control. A newly crowned leader might insist that every microscopic detail be executed exactly according to their personal preference. This manifests as a paralyzing perfectionism. It drains the creative energy of the team, turning collaborative environments into silent dictatorships where talented subordinates simply stop trying, exhausted by the constant, meaningless friction. Finally, as the burdens of power isolate the individual, paranoia sets in. The ego whispers that nobody can be trusted, that everyone is secretly plotting their downfall or seeking to exploit their genius. The irony of paranoia is that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Seneca wisely noted that those who indulge in empty fabricated fears will eventually earn themselves real ones. By constantly suspecting others, lashing out at perceived slights, and erecting defensive walls, the paranoid leader alienates their supporters and inadvertently creates the very enemies they feared. They become prisoners of their own chaotic delusions, actively destroying the freedom they originally sought to achieve. Managing yourself On the evening following his 1953 inauguration, Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped into the White House to begin his tenure as President of the United States. His chief usher approached and handed him 2 envelopes marked confidential and secret. Rather than eagerly tearing them open, Eisenhower firmly instructed the usher to never bring him a sealed envelope again, stating that this was exactly what he had a staff for. This was not a display of executive snobbery. It was an immediate, calculated establishment of organizational discipline. Eisenhower understood that a leader who personally manages every trivial piece of information is a leader doomed to fail. His primary objective was to transform the executive branch into a highly functional, order-driven machine, much like the military commands he had previously mastered. He operated on a fundamental principle of delegation. The president handles the most critical matters, and his chief of staff handles the next most critical matters. While the public often saw Eisenhower casually playing golf, this leisure was only possible because he had meticulously constructed a system that functioned perfectly without his constant micromanagement. Compare this systematic brilliance to the disastrous trajectory of John DeLorean. After rising through the ranks of General Motors, DeLorean left to create his own futuristic car company. He harbored a deep resentment for the strict corporate discipline of his former employer, convinced that it stifled visionary creatives like himself. Consequently, he designed his new enterprise to flout conventional business practices entirely. The result was not a utopian haven of innovation, but a chaotic, deeply dysfunctional, and ultimately corrupt organization. DeLorean's failure was a direct result of his inability to manage himself. He was described by his own executives as a man who constantly chased shiny distractions, abandoning crucial projects on a whim. He possessed a genius for identifying opportunities, but lacked the operational discipline to execute them. He failed to provide clear direction, refused to delegate effectively, and surrounded himself with sycophants who prioritized blind loyalty over actual competence. He cultivated a culture of dishonesty that eventually permeated the entire company, leading to catastrophic production failures, millions of dollars in losses, and his own highly publicized arrest. The transition from a hungry aspirer to a realized leader requires a radical shift in identity. The idiosyncratic, unstructured hustle that works for a solo visionary will absolutely destroy a large organization. Leadership requires the humility to step back from the enjoyable, hands-on tasks and assume the heavy burden of high-level decision-making. It means trusting experts to do their jobs without interference. The ego desperately wants to be involved in every minor crisis, craving the constant validation of being the indispensable boss. But true management means setting the broader vision, enforcing the ultimate standards, and resisting the urge to meddle. If the head of the organization is obsessed with the minutiae, no one is charting the overarching course, and the entire ship will eventually run aground. Beware the disease of me. When assessing the pantheon of brilliant Allied generals who orchestrated the victory of World War II, men like Patton, MacArthur, and Montgomery, one figure stands distinct from the rest: General George C. Marshall. While his peers were undeniably brave and effective, their legacies are often tainted by rampant political maneuvering, bitter infighting, and an insatiable thirst for the historical spotlight. Marshall, on the other hand, navigated the entire global conflict, virtually untouched by the toxic vanity that consumed his contemporaries. The legendary basketball coach Pat Riley coined a term for this psychological phenomenon. He observed that when a team first sets out to win, they experience an innocent climb. They are united, selfless, and singularly focused on the collective goal. However, the moment they achieve that victory and the media spotlight hits them, the bonds of unity begin to dissolve. Players calculate their individual market value, resentments brew over who receives the most credit, and the disease of me infects the Lockeroos. This disease has dismantled championship dynasties, bankrupted massive corporations, and ruined countless promising partnerships. It is the insidious belief that our individual specialness outweighs the mission itself. General Marshall serves as history's ultimate antidote to the disease of me. His relationship with power and rank was defined by a breathtaking selflessness, while other officers constantly lobbied for promotions. Often employing family members to pressure politicians on their behalf, Marshall actively discouraged his own advancement. When allies attempted to pass legislation promoting him to the unprecedented rank of Field Marshal, he personally intervened to stop it. Not only did he think the title sounded absurd, but he refused to outrank his aging mentor, General Pershing. His internal sense of honor completely superseded any external need for validation. Marshall's ultimate test arrived in the planning of D-Day. The command of the largest amphibious invasion in human history was his for the taking. President Roosevelt essentially offered him the role, knowing it would guarantee Marshall's immortal place in the history books. Yet, recognizing that his strategic presence was desperately needed in Washington, Marshall refused to advocate for his own glory, telling the president to make the decision based solely on what was best for the country. The command and the eternal glory went to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ego recoils at such sacrifices. It demands its rightful due and views any concession as an unforgivable weakness. But Marshall understood that true greatness is inherently tied to serving the larger cause. He was even known to forgive and utilize officers who had previously sabotaged his career, recognizing their strategic value to the nation over his own right to personal vengeance. He once sat for an official portrait, and when the artist finally announced it was finished, Marshall simply stood up and walked out of the room without ever looking at the canvas. He had no interest in gazing at his own image. By completely suppressing his ego, he was able to operate with unparalleled clarity, ultimately shaping the entire modern world without ever demanding the credit for it. Aspire Talk, Talk, Talk. In 1934, the author Upton Sinclair made an unorthodox and ultimately disastrous move during his campaign for the governorship of California. Before the election had even taken place, he published a book outlining, in the past tense, the brilliant policies he had supposedly already enacted as governor. While intended to leverage his unique strength as a writer, observers noted a devastating psychological side effect. Sinclair lost his actual will to campaign. Having vividly acted out his victory in his imagination and heavily detailed it on the page, the agonizing real-world effort required to achieve it suddenly felt redundant. He lost the election by a massive margin, vividly demonstrating the danger of allowing talk to get ahead of the actual work. Modern technology has constructed a world that aggressively solicits our constant chatter. Social media platforms continuously present blank text boxes begging us to announce our intentions, broadcast our desires, and celebrate our half-baked plans. At the beginning of any ambitious path, we are naturally gripped by fear and uncertainty. Instead of sitting with that profound discomfort and translating it into hard labor, ego seeks the immediate soothing validation of public attention. The writer, Emily Gould, recognized this paralyzing trap during her prolonged struggle to produce a novel. She spent a year tweeting, blogging, and obsessively curating her digital brand, fatally mistaking the public performance of being a writer for the actual agonizing act of writing. Silence, contrary to loud cultural assumptions, is a profound source of strength. The philosopher Kierkegaard explicitly warned that expressing an unformed thought drastically weakens the ability to act upon it. Scientific research corroborates this ancient wisdom, demonstrating that extensive verbalization of our goals tricks the brain into feeling a false sense of progress, depleting the exact energy required to overcome the steep hurdles of creative execution. While anyone can generate hype or boast about future conquests, true masters operate in deliberate, heavily guarded silence. They wrestle with the terrifying void of creation in strict privacy, refusing to substitute the cheap thrill of an audience's applause for the enduring value of completed work. To succeed, one must consciously plug the drain of idle chatter and redirect that vital life force entirely into the relentless pursuit of the craft. To be or to do. John Boyd remains one of the most transformative strategic minds in modern military history, despite being completely unknown to the general public. As a legendary fighter pilot and instructor, he revolutionized maneuver warfare and was the architectural force behind the F-15 and F-16 fighter jets. Yet, Boyd deliberately chose a path of absolute obscurity. He published essentially nothing, avoided the press at all costs, and retired as a mere colonel, having made far more enemies than friends within the rigid bureaucracy of the Pentagon. This was not an accident, but the execution of a strict, unyielding personal philosophy. Boyd regularly summoned promising young acolytes into his office to deliver a serious speech about a critical fork in the road. He would gesture in one direction, outlining the path to be somebody, a route paved with moral compromises, betrayals, and the glittering rewards of rank, prestigious assignments, and exclusive club membership. Pointing in the other direction, he offered the path to do something, a grueling commitment to authentic work and loyalty that guaranteed a lack of promotions and the hatred of superiors, but preserved one's soul. Life, Boyd insisted, presents a constant roll call where this exact choice must be made. The ego fundamentally blurs the distinction between having authority and genuinely being an authority. It aggressively convinces us that prestigious job titles, corner offices, or massive social media followings are accurate proxies for actual achievement. Boyd observed this corruption firsthand, illustrating how institutions inevitably warp noble values like duty, honor, and country into the toxic pursuits of pride, power, and greed. When your defining purpose is simply to matter to the world, to protect your reputation and secure personal ease, the path of least resistance is to constantly stroke the egos of others and chase the superficial markers of success. Conversely, when your purpose transcends yourself, every single opportunity must be subjected to a ruthless binary evaluation. Does this action serve the ultimate goal, or does it merely serve my vanity? Operating on this higher plane requires accepting that the egocentric path relies entirely on compromises. Boyd radically altered the landscape of modern warfare precisely because he absolutely refused to compromise his vision for the sake of a promotion. He died in relative obscurity, leaving behind uncashed expense checks he viewed as bribes, completely satisfied that he had chosen to do rather than simply to be. Become a student. In the early 1980s, the underground metal band Metallica fired their lead guitarist and abruptly handed the job to a young musician named Kirk Hammett. It was the ultimate dream realized. He had joined a group destined for global, stadium-filling stardom. Yet, Hammett's reaction to this sudden professional validation was extraordinarily humble. Recognizing critical gaps in his foundational understanding of music theory, he actively sought out a notoriously strict guitar teacher named Joe Satriani. Despite already possessing the raw talent to shred in front of thousands, Hammett subjected himself to 2 years of rigorous remedial drilling, allowing a master to ruthlessly tear down his bad habits and expose his weaknesses. This is the raw, untethered power of the student mindset. It acts as an absolute ceiling on the ego by forcing an individual to completely defer to someone with greater knowledge. The human psyche naturally recoils from admitting inferiority or acknowledging the vastness of what it does not yet know. When granted a sudden elevation in status, the ego's immediate reflex is to declare the learning phase officially over, to assume that the promotion itself is ironclad proof of flawless mastery. But true, enduring greatness demands a constant, studious downward appraisal of one's own abilities. The mixed martial arts pioneer, Frank Shamrock, institutionalized this philosophy with his strict plus, minus, and equal training system. To reach maximum potential, Shamrock insisted that a fighter must always have a mentor to learn from, a lesser student to teach, and an equal peer to brutally test themselves against. This continuous loop of multi-directional feedback purges the mind of the false delusions that historically destroy careers. You cannot genuinely absorb new information if you are already violently convinced of your own perfection. The ego fundamentally despises harsh, critical feedback, rushing past the necessary periods of quiet incubation to prematurely announce its genius to the world. To prevent this fatal stagnation, one must aggressively adopt the posture of a sponge, seeking out rigorous instruction and welcoming the uncomfortable reality that there is always more to learn. Don't be passionate. Modern culture incessantly evangelizes the supreme importance of passion. It is championed as the vital fuel for every worthwhile endeavor, the magical ingredient that guarantees success and inspires the masses. Yet, an objective analysis of history reveals a far more sobering truth. Passion is frequently the exact psychological flaw that drives brilliant, ambitious individuals straight off a cliff. When a young admirer complimented Eleanor Roosevelt on her passionate interest in social legislation, the formidable First Lady politely but firmly rejected the label. She was governed by grace, poise, and reason, actively eschewing the frantic, unbridled enthusiasm that characterizes true passion. Unchecked passion functions as a blinding, lethal intoxication. It was the fervent, unquestioning belief of the Segway's creators that led them to completely misjudge the market, just as the manic zeal of early polar explorers pushed them into fatal, unprepared disaster. Passion masks fatal weaknesses with a flurry of breathlessness and frantic motion, serving as a poor, dangerous substitute for mastery and discipline. The passionately afflicted can vividly describe their ultimate vision and narrate their inevitable glory, but they are entirely incapable of demonstrating iterative, daily progress. They become trapped in the passion paradox, burning tremendous amounts of energy, spinning their wheels against the asphalt while moving nowhere. What the monumental ascent truly requires is profound purpose, coupled with ruthless realism. Purpose differs from passion in that it is fundamentally decoupled from the ego. It is not about what you desire to be, but what objective tasks absolutely must be done. It functions with strict boundaries, deliberately replacing manic epiphanies and sweeping manifestos with the unglamorous, methodical execution of small, critical steps, as the legendary basketball coach John Wooden demonstrated through his notoriously dispassionate leadership style. Enduring empires are built not on emotional rah-rah speeches, but on exact, repeatable systems of excellence. To accomplish great things, one must leave the frantic zeal to the amateurs and proceed with the chilling, calculated deliberation of a professional. Strategy. In the rigid social hierarchy of ancient Rome, aspiring artists and thinkers often survived by attaching themselves to wealthy patrons. They functioned as anti-ambulus, literally, the ones who cleared the path, walking ahead of their benefactors to ease their travel and communicate their messages. The epigrammist Martial absolutely despised this subservient role, consuming himself with bitter resentment over the perceived indignities he suffered while servicing the elite. Blinded by his ego, Martial failed to realize that this very access to the inner workings of power was the precise material that made his historical writings so brilliantly insightful. The modern equivalent of this ego-driven resentment is the intern who furiously believes they are overqualified, or the brilliant graduate who views entry-level support tasks as a demeaning insult to their genius. This entitlement operates on the deeply flawed assumption that raw talent automatically grants immediate authority. The absolute most effective way to purge this toxic attitude is to actively adopt the canvas strategy, deliberately finding blank canvases for other, more successful people to paint on. It requires subsuming your own identity and aggressively seeking out ways to eliminate distractions and solve problems for those above you. Benjamin Franklin masterfully executed this strategy when he anonymously slipped his brilliantly crafted Silence Dogood letters under the door of his brother's print shop. He allowed his brother to reap the massive financial rewards and public credit, recognizing that the true prize was the opportunity to test his ideas and shape public opinion without interference. Similarly, legendary football coach Bill Belichick began his ascent by volunteering to do the grueling, unpaid grunt work of analyzing game film, tasks the senior coaches actively despised. By happily surrendering the immediate credit and focusing entirely on making his superiors look brilliant, he gathered an unparalleled encyclopedic knowledge of the game. The canvas strategy is an infinitely scalable investment. By happily clearing the path for others, you ultimately gain total control over its final direction. Restrain yourself. It is a profound misconception to believe that the path to breaking barriers requires a loud, explosive defiance. Consider the integration of Major League Baseball. Before becoming the iconic figure of racial integration in sports, Jackie Robinson was a man with a fierce, well-documented temper. As a younger man, he engaged in street fights, clashed with law enforcement, and even faced a court-martial in the military for rightfully refusing to sit in the back of a segregated bus. When Brooklyn Dodgers executive branch Rickey sought the right individual to shatter baseball's color barrier, he was not looking for a player who would fight back against the inevitable abuse. Rickey specifically demanded a player with the supreme courage to endure humiliation without retaliation. This agreement required Robinson to entirely suppress his ego and natural human instincts. He faced a barrage of physical and verbal assaults, intentional physical harm on the field, death threats, and abhorrent racial slurs from both fans and opposing managers. While white players of his era, such as Ted Williams, could freely express contempt for fans without severe career repercussions, Robinson possessed no such luxury. Any outburst, however justified, would have destroyed the grand experiment of integration. He even agreed to pose for a photograph with one of his most virulent abusers, a rival manager, simply to serve the larger strategic goal. Whenever an individual sets out to accomplish something significant, they will inevitably encounter resistance, indifference, and outright sabotage. The ego demands immediate vindication. It screams at the perceived injustice of being treated poorly by those who possess less talent or vision. Yet, reacting to every slight is a recipe for disaster. True strength is found in quiet endurance. The up-and-coming must willingly absorb the abuses of the entrenched establishment. Only by restraining the impulse to fight every battle can one survive long enough to fundamentally change the system. Get out of your own head. A pervasive danger for the ambitious is the tendency to retreat into a self-constructed mental narrative rather than engaging with the tangible world. Literature is filled with protagonists who suffer from this paralyzing self-absorption. Characters who view their own lives as a movie or a novel in which they are the tortured, misunderstood star. This fictional affliction mirrors reality, where brilliant minds often feasted on their own thoughts, confusing daydreams with actual progress. During the American Civil War, General George McClellan exemplified this fatal flaw. Entrusted with commanding the Union forces, McClellan possessed all the theoretical qualifications for greatness. However, he was utterly trapped in his own head. He spent his time constructing elaborate fantasies of his own strategic genius and imagining vast, non-existent enemy armies, which repeatedly paralyzed his ability to act. His colossal egotism rendered him incapable of hearing feedback or leading men into actual combat, squandering massive advantages and costing thousands of lives. The ego functions as a relentless internal broadcast, alternating between grandiose self-aggrandizement and crippling self-doubt. It creates an imaginary audience, a psychological state common in adolescence, where individuals believe their every move is being watched and judged by the world. To combat this, one must ruthlessly tether themselves to reality. General George C. Marshall actively refused to keep a diary during World War II, recognizing that the mere act of writing for a future audience might subconsciously warp his decision-making process into a theatrical performance. Living effectively requires abandoning the haze of abstraction, ignoring the opening credits montage playing in the mind, and engaging directly with the unglamorous, concrete tasks at hand. The danger of early pride. When Benjamin Franklin was just 18, he returned to his hometown dressed in new clothes, proudly displaying a pocket full of silver to impress his former acquaintances. His arrogant posturing was interrupted during a visit with Cotton Mather, who abruptly warned the young man to stoop just before Franklin slammed his head into a low-ceiling beam. Mather used the moment to deliver a lasting lesson. Walking through the world with one's head held too high guarantees a life filled with painful thumps. Pride is a fundamental distortion of reality. It artificially inflates minor early achievements, convincing individuals that their initial momentum is proof of permanent genius. It whispers dangerous validations, transforming the act of starting a project into the premature declaration of ultimate victory. This early conceit blunts the mind's ability to learn and adapt, replacing necessary humility with a rigid, fragile arrogance. To survive the early stages of success, one must actively wage war against this creeping self-satisfaction. John D. Rockefeller, upon experiencing his first tastes of financial success, instituted a rigorous practice of nightly self-interrogation. He brutally reminded himself not to let a small amount of money warp his judgment or puff up his ego. Genghis Khan imparted a similar wisdom to his heirs, warning them that if they could not conquer their own pride, they were entirely unfit to lead others. True self-knowledge breeds humility, serving as a vital shield against the blinding, intoxicating effects of early validation. Work. 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 The French painter Edgar Degas once complained to a poet friend that despite being overflowing with brilliant ideas, he could not seem to craft a good poem. His friend succinctly diagnosed the problem. Poetry is not made with ideas, but with words. The gulf between a fleeting thought and a finalized creation can only be crossed through grueling, unglamorous labor. The ego inherently recoils at the prospect of boundless, unrecognized effort. It seeks the shortcut, preferring the thrill of conceptualizing a grand vision over the agonizing reality of executing it. History is shaped by those who embraced the relentless grind. A young Bill Clinton meticulously collected and maintained thousands of index cards with the names and details of political contacts long before he needed them. Charles Darwin toiled in absolute obscurity for decades to perfect his theory of evolution, completely devoid of public encouragement. Basketball great Bill Bradley drove himself with the constant, haunting reminder that somewhere an opponent was practicing while he was resting. Modern culture promotes the dangerous illusion that one can simply fake it till they make it. Yet true professionals do not fake their expertise. They forge it through tens of thousands of hours of deliberate practice. The work requires ignoring external plaudits, delaying gratification, and finding the fortitude to sit alone with the material, day after day, until it bends to the Creator's will. For everything that comes next, ego is the enemy. In the early stages of creative or professional development, individuals possess an inherent taste that exceeds their actual talent. This gap creates a painful cognitive dissonance. To bridge it, the ego offers a seductive Faustian bargain. It suggests masking incompetence with loud audacity, using bluster to cover up a lack of genuine skill. Much like athletes who turn to performance-enhancing drugs, the ambitious attempted to use ego as an artificial stimulant to forcefully accelerate their ascent. Choosing the path of genuine substance is a lonely and arduous endeavor. It requires refusing the intoxicating shortcuts and committing to the slow, quiet development of character and capability. This was the deliberate choice made by William Tecumseh Sherman, who spent years in obscure postings forging a deeply grounded, realistic foundation. By the time the immense pressures of history fell upon his shoulders, he possessed the unshakable equilibrium necessary to navigate them without being destroyed by his own vanity. The ultimate challenge is to arrive at the summit with one's soul intact, prepared for the profound tests that accompany achievement. At the pinnacle of a mountain that required immense labor to climb, the air grows dangerously thin. It is in this unforgiving environment that a new array of temptations emerges. The ephemeral nature of success is deeply tied to the ego, which works to shorten the lifespan of any victory. When accomplishment is secured, the very habits that built it, listening, learning, and grounding oneself in purpose, are often the first to be abandoned. The story of Howard Hughes perfectly illustrates this tragic unspooling. Inheriting an incredibly lucrative tool company at 18, Hughes possessed the audacity to buy out his relatives and consolidate total ownership. While history often remembers him as a bold visionary and a pioneering aviator, a clear-eyed assessment reveals a deeply flawed man who squandered hundreds of millions of dollars. He treated his father's immensely profitable enterprise as nothing more than a personal slush fund to finance his chaotic obsessions. He lost staggering sums in the stock market, hemorrhaged money in the film industry, and produced colossal failures like the Spruce Goose, an aircraft that cost taxpayers millions and flew only once. Hughes was undeniably a genius. Yet his life serves as a terrifying metaphor for the ego's destructive capacity. One hand worked furiously to build a monumental legacy, while the other hand worked just as relentlessly to tear it down. The celebrated CEO Harold Janine understood this dynamic, noting that the worst disease to afflict successful individuals is not addiction to substances, but an addiction to oneself. This egotism creates a blinding distortion of reality, convincing a leader that they are infallible while they actively sabotage their own organizations. Survival at the top requires rigorous sobriety, an open mind, and strict organization. Without these stabilizers, the same drive that propelled an individual to success will inevitably drag them into isolation and ruin. Always stay a student. The historical memory of Genghis Khan is often limited to the image of a bloodthirsty barbarian sweeping across the steppes. However, the true foundation of his unprecedented global supremacy was his extraordinary capacity as a perpetual student. The Mongol Empire did not expand through brute force alone, but through a calculated, deliberate absorption of the technologies, strategies, and knowledge of every culture it encountered. When his armies faced walled cities for the first time, Khan did not stubbornly rely on traditional cavalry tactics. He humbly sought the expertise of Chinese engineers to master the art of siege warfare. He systematically recruited the brightest astrologers, doctors, and scholars from conquered lands to advise his court. The empire's success was fundamentally rooted in this philosophy of appropriation, combining innovations like Chinese gunpowder with European metallurgy. Khan's greatness stemmed precisely from his willingness to admit his own ignorance and eagerly learn from the world around him. As new heights are reached, the horizon of the unknown expands simultaneously. The temptation is to project an aura of complete mastery, allowing past victories to justify a cessation of learning. Yet, the moment an individual believes their education is complete, their creative and intellectual death begins. The renowned musician Wynton Marsalis observed that true humility is the bedrock of continuous improvement, as it actively beats back the arrogance that blinds us to new truths. To sustain greatness, one must systematically seek out environments where they are the least knowledgeable person in the room. The commitment to being a lifelong student is the only reliable defense against the creeping obsolescence born of success. Don't tell yourself a story. In 1979, Bill Walsh took over the San Francisco 49ers, inheriting the worst franchise in professional sports. Within 3 years, he transformed the team into Super Bowl champions. From that glorious summit, it would have been effortless to craft a narrative of destined genius, to claim that this rapid ascent was the execution of a masterful, predetermined timeline. Walsh, however, fiercely rejected this mythology. He understood that projecting grandiose timelines onto a shattered organization was an exercise in delusion. Instead of fixating on championship glory, he devoted his entire focus to implementing a rigorous standard of performance. He obsessed over the microscopic details, the exact execution of passing routes, the cleanliness of the locker room, the professional attire of the staff. His philosophy was rooted in the unshakable belief that if the organization relentlessly pursued excellence in its daily actions, the final score would naturally resolve itself. The human mind possesses a dangerous impulse to retroactively weave messy realities into neat, heroic narratives. We look back at unlikely triumphs and convince ourselves that they were inevitable. This storytelling breeds a toxic arrogance, blinding us to the gritty, unglamorous effort that actually produced the victory. Enduring success is never a compelling story written in hindsight. It is the chaotic, iterative byproduct of continuous adaptation and an unwavering grip on reality. Embracing the myth of one's own genius is the fastest route to ensuring that the success is never replicated. What's important to you? In the aftermath of the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman stood as the nation's most revered heroes. Granted the freedom to dictate their futures, they chose radically different paths. Sherman, possessing a deep understanding of his own nature and a revulsion for the political machine, resolutely declined all pressure to run for public office. He recognized when he had enough, prioritizing his internal compass over external acclaim. Grant, despite a profound lack of political acumen, succumbed to the intoxicating pull of the presidency. His administration was plagued by controversy and corruption, ultimately leaving him exhausted and maligned. Further driven by a misplaced desire to rival the wealth of the elite, he partnered with a fraudulent investor, a catastrophic decision that plunged him into public bankruptcy. He spent his final agonizing days racing to finish his memoirs simply to save his family from destitution. Grant's ultimate tragedy was his inability to accurately define what truly mattered to his own soul. Success brings a disorienting influx of opportunities and comparisons. Surrounded by other high achievers, the ego breeds a toxic envy, whispering that one must possess everything that others have. To combat this destructive cycle, one must cultivate the ancient Greek concept of euthymia, the profound tranquility that arises from knowing one's own path and remaining steadfastly upon it. It requires the difficult introspective work of identifying true purpose and ruthlessly ignoring the distracting pace of everyone else. True independence is not found in accumulating the most accolades, but in having the courage to define the singular, meaningful race you are actually meant to run. Entitlement, control, and paranoia. When the Persian Emperor Xerxes launched his massive invasion of Greece, his engineers constructed floating bridges across the Hellespont to facilitate the crossing. When the unpredictable waters surged and destroyed the structures, Xerxes did not react as a rational leader facing a logistical hurdle. Instead, he ordered his men to hurl heavy chains into the water, strike the river with 300 lashes, and brand it with red-hot irons. He even commanded his soldiers to verbally berate the water for daring to defy him, before ultimately having the engineers beheaded. Previously, he had written a letter to a mountain, threatening to topple it into the sea if it obstructed his planned canal. While history views these acts as preposterous, they are symptoms of a highly recognizable psychological affliction that often accompanies extreme power, a toxic triad of entitlement, control, and paranoia. The traits that originally fuel an individual's ascent, such as raw force of will, the defiance of skeptics, and a refusal to accept traditional odds, can easily mutate into severe delusions once success is achieved. Because ignoring the rules worked once, the newly successful individual begins to believe they possess a magical ability to bend reality to their whims. This was evident in the creator of the Beanie Babies empire, who became so blinded by his past commercial triumphs that he disastrously ignored his team's warnings, convinced he could slap his logo on actual manure and it would sell. Without relentless self-awareness, ambition calcifies into a dangerous entitlement that views the time, energy, and lives of others as completely subservient to one's own desires. The compulsion to control every microscopic detail exhausts talented subordinates and paralyzes an organization. Furthermore, as power isolates the individual, paranoia inevitably sets in. The ego begins to suspect that everyone is plotting a betrayal. By lashing out at perceived slights and erecting defensive barriers, the paranoid leader inadvertently alienates their supporters and actively creates the very enemies they feared, becoming a prisoner of their own chaotic delusions. Managing yourself. On his first evening in the White House following his inauguration, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was handed 2 sealed envelopes marked confidential and secret by his chief usher. Eisenhower immediately rejected them, strictly instructing his staff never to bring him a sealed envelope again, stating that opening mail was exactly what he had a staff for. This was not an act of executive arrogance, it was the immediate establishment of organizational discipline. Eisenhower understood that a leader who personally manages every trivial piece of information is destined to fail. His objective was to build a highly functional machine where he handled only the most critical overarching priorities, trusting his subordinates to manage everything else. This systematic brilliance stands in stark contrast to the disastrous approach of John DeLorean, who abandoned General Motors to create his own futuristic car company. Resenting the strict corporate discipline of GM, DeLorean designed his new enterprise to completely flout conventional business practices. The result was a chaotic, dysfunctional organization. DeLorean proved incapable of managing himself. He constantly chased shiny distractions, failed to delegate effectively, and cultivated a culture of dishonesty and blind loyalty over competence. His inability to provide clear direction led to catastrophic production failures, staggering financial losses, and his eventual arrest. The transition from a solitary striver to a realized leader requires a radical shift in identity. The unstructured hustle that propels a lone visionary will completely destroy a larger organization. True management demands the humility to step back from the enjoyable, hands-on tasks and assume the heavy burden of high-level decision-making. The ego desperately craves the constant validation of being the indispensable center of attention. But if the leader is obsessed with the minutiae, no one is charting the overarching course. Beware the disease of me. When evaluating the pantheon of brilliant Allied generals from World War II, George C. Marshall stands entirely distinct from contemporaries like Patton or MacArthur. While others were consumed by political posturing and an insatiable thirst for the historical spotlight, Marshall navigated the global conflict virtually untouched by vanity. Legendary basketball coach Pat Riley identified the exact psychological phenomenon that fells most champions, the disease of me. Riley observed that teams often experience an innocent climb, where members are selfless and united. However, once victory is achieved, individuals begin calculating their personal market value and demanding greater credit, dissolving the very bonds that made them great. General Marshall serves as the ultimate historical antidote to this disease. He actively discouraged his own promotions, even personally intervening to stop legislation that would have elevated him to the unprecedented rank of Field Marshal. He refused to outrank his aging mentor and possessed an internal sense of honor that completely superseded any need for external validation. When President Roosevelt essentially offered him the command of the D-Day invasion, a role that guaranteed eternal historical glory, Marshall refused to advocate for himself, advising the president to choose based strictly on what was best for the country. The command went to Eisenhower. Ego recoils at such profound selflessness, demanding its rightful due and viewing concessions as weakness. Yet Marshall understood that true greatness is inherently tied to serving the larger mission. He was so thoroughly detached from vanity that after sitting for an official portrait, he simply walked away without ever turning to look at the finished canvas. By completely suppressing his ego, he operated with unparalleled clarity, shaping the modern world without ever demanding the credit for it. Meditate on the immensity. In 1879, the explorer John Muir found himself in the icy expanses of Alaska. Surrounded by the majestic fjords and the profound ecosystem of Glacier Bay, he experienced a sudden, powerful realization of the interconnectedness of all living things. He felt a deep sympathy with the cosmos, an experience the Stoics called sympathia, or what others term the oceanic feeling. In these rare moments, humanity recognizes its infinitesimal place within the vast immensity of the universe, prompting critical questions about true purpose and existence. Nothing severs an individual from this grounding perspective quite like material success. When one is constantly busy, elevated, and told they are uniquely important, the ego asserts that meaning is derived entirely from being the center of attention. This detachment from anything larger than the self leaves the soul hollow and exhausted. The antidote is to actively seek out environments and historical contexts that forcefully remind us of our smallness. Standing on an ancient battlefield, or realizing that the bones of actual lions lie buried beneath the modern concrete of Trafalgar Square, shatters the delusion of our unprecedented uniqueness. The ego cannot survive contact with the infinite. To combat the toxic self-absorption of success, one must deliberately step into nature, history, or solitude to reconcile with the process of life that existed long before them and will continue long after they are gone. Maintain your sobriety. German Chancellor Angela Merkel presents a stark contrast to the traditional archetype of a global leader. She eschews fiery rhetoric, dramatic posturing, and the intoxicating allure of charisma in favor of plain, modest, and quiet reservation. Her unparalleled success and enduring influence are rooted entirely in a profound sobriety. When Russian President Vladimir Putin attempted to intimidate her during a meeting by releasing his large hunting dog, Merkel did not react with the frantic escalation or defensive posturing typical of an inflated ego. She remained calm and objective, ultimately making Putin appear insecure and foolish. The ego insists that the manic energy and aggressive dominance that fueled the initial ascent are necessary to maintain power. However, endless, unbridled energy is fundamentally unsustainable. Like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who constantly fought against the corrupting imperialization of his office, leaders must actively fight to remain sober. True effectiveness requires eliminating the destructive obsession with personal image and treating others with quiet respect. Sobriety acts as the essential counterweight to prosperity, ensuring that judgment remains clear precisely when the stakes are highest. For what often comes next, ego is the enemy. Arriving at the pinnacle of achievement reveals a terrifying reality. Managing success is infinitely harder than acquiring it. Aristotle taught his famous pupil, Alexander the Great, the concept of the golden mean, the delicate middle ground between two extreme vices. While Alexander conquered the world, he failed to master this internal balance, pushing too hard and dying far from home. The challenge of success is neither succumbing to complacency nor falling prey to the undisciplined pursuit of more. When egotism seizes control, the original drive for fulfillment mutates into a hollow chase for fame and excess. Napoleon overreached until his empire vanished like artillery smoke, and Howard Hughes ended his days in miserable, isolated madness. Prosperity offers absolutely no guarantees. The laws of nature ensure that regression and reversal are inevitable. Instead of allowing power to breed delusion, one must use periods of success to rigorously prepare for the inevitable shifts of fate. For the first half of her life, Catherine Graham experienced a world where everything seemingly fell perfectly into place. Raised by a brilliant socialite mother and a financial genius father who purchased the struggling Washington Post in 1933, she enjoyed the absolute best that wealth and privilege could offer. She eventually inherited the newspaper, happily handing its management over to her highly capable husband, Philip Graham, content to remain securely in the background. However, this comfortable trajectory shattered when her husband suffered a severe mental breakdown, culminating in his tragic suicide while she rested in the next room. At 46 years old, possessing zero executive experience, Graham suddenly found herself at the helm of a massive corporation. Her subsequent tenure was a relentless baptism by fire. She faced a patronizing, risk-averse board of directors who continually held the company back. She confronted the agonizing decision to publish the stolen Pentagon Papers against the fierce advice of her own lawyers who feared devastating lawsuits. The paper's pursuit of the Watergate scandal positioned her directly in the crosshairs of the Nixon White House, with the Attorney General explicitly threatening her and aides actively plotting to destroy her company. She endured a vicious strike by the Printers' Union, who sabotaged machinery, beat an innocent staffer, and set printing presses ablaze. Through it all, she survived, fundamentally transforming the company, executing brilliant stock buybacks with the guidance of Warren Buffett, and ultimately guiding her initial $1 public offering to an $89 valuation by the time she stepped down. Graham's story illustrates the universal reality that failure and profound adversity eventually intrude upon every human plan. The economist George Goodman likened this phenomenon to a splendid ball where everyone dances happily, fully aware that at some unknown hour, black horsemen will violently shatter the terrace doors to wreak vengeance on the attendees. When these dark, unavoidable moments arrive, ego proves to be a fatal liability. Psychologists use the term narcissistic injury to describe how individuals with fragile, ego-driven identities take entirely objective events personally, allowing inevitable life friction to destroy them. Surviving the abyss requires strength, purpose, and the complete abandonment of the delusion that life owes us fairness or an unbroken string of victories. Alive time or dead time. Long before he became an iconic historical figure, Malcolm X was known as Detroit Red, a street-level criminal who engaged in drug dealing, running numbers, and eventually leading an armed burglary ring. His escalating life of crime was halted in 1946 when he was arrested trying to fence a stolen watch, resulting in a decade-long prison sentence. Confined to a cage at barely 21 years old, he faced a critical divergence that the author Robert Greene defines as the choice between alive time and dead time. Dead time is marked by passivity, anger, and waiting. Alive time is utilized for learning, acting, and rigorous self-transformation. Malcolm deliberately chose alive time. He requested a dictionary and a pencil from the prison library, meticulously copying every single word from cover to cover to teach himself how to read and grasp the vastness of language. He devoured texts on history, philosophy, and religion, effectively turning his incarceration into an intense university education. This profound internal shift allowed him to transcend his physical confinement entirely, later noting that months passed without him even thinking about being detained. Historically, moments of severe restriction have frequently forged greatness. Francis Scott Key penned the American national anthem while held prisoner on a ship, and Viktor Frankl crystallized his profound psychological theories amidst the unimaginable horrors of Nazi concentration camps. When catastrophic setbacks occur, the ego violently resists. It wants to scream at the injustice, plot revenge, or seek refuge in mindless distraction. It tempts the afflicted to double down on the exact behaviors that led to their downfall, transforming literal or figurative prisons into factories for bitterness and further failure. True resilience demands casting aside this stubbornness and actively utilizing the barren circumstances for deep, foundational improvement. As Booker T. Washington famously advised, one must cast down their bucket exactly where they stand, refusing to let the capriciousness of fate dictate the value of their given time. The effort is enough. Serving as the highest-ranking military commander under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, Belisarius achieved feats that fundamentally saved Western civilization. Before the age of 40, he reclaimed massive, far-flung territories, secured brilliant victories across Carthage and Sicily, and boldly defended the throne with a handful of guards against riotous uprisings that had nearly forced the emperor's abdication. Yet, the rewards for his unparalleled service were virtually non-existent. He was denied public triumphs, constantly viewed with toxic suspicion by the paranoid Justinian, relieved of his command, and ultimately stripped of his hard-earned wealth. Legend dictates that he was even blinded and forced to beg on the streets for survival. Amidst this staggering injustice, the one voice utterly devoid of complaint belonged to Belisarius himself. He never betrayed his ruler or succumbed to the vices of absolute power. For him, executing his duty with excellence and honor was entirely sufficient. This highlights an agonizing reality of human ambition. Work inevitably leaves the creator's hands to be judged and rewarded by an indifferent, often capricious world. When ego drives the effort, a lack of external validation feels like a catastrophic insult. It fosters a crippling expectation hangover when the anticipated applause fails to materialize. The antidote to this psychological dependency is shifting the very definition of success. Legendary basketball coach John Wooden taught his players that true victory is simply the peace of mind derived from knowing one made the absolute best effort possible. Tying personal well-being to external reception leads to tragedies like that of author John Kennedy Toole, who committed suicide after his brilliant manuscript for a confederacy of dunces was repeatedly rejected by publishers. Years after his death, his mother championed the exact same unedited book, and it ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize. The work was always magnificent, but his inability to separate his self-worth from the industry's immediate validation destroyed him. To survive the inevitable rejections and unappreciated masterstrokes of life, doing the work must genuinely be its own complete reward. Fight Club moments. Countless successful individuals have experienced the jarring, perspective-altering reality of hitting rock bottom. The stories are almost legendary. J.K. Rowling facing near homelessness as a single mother, a young Charlie Parker being chased off a stage in utter humiliation by a throne symbol, Lyndon Johnson having his arrogant self-image shattered in a physical beating. The novel Fight Club captures this phenomenon viscerally when the protagonist's apartment, filled with the possessions he pathetically loved, is blown up, an act orchestrated by his own alter ego to shock him out of a sad stupor. Greek mythology describes this descent as katabasis, a forced retreat into the underworld from which a hero emerges with heightened understanding. When the illusions we build around ourselves harden into a permanent, toxic state, it often takes a catastrophic Fight Club moment to shatter the facade and force a confrontation with reality. These moments of ruin usually share three characteristics. They are triggered by an outside force, they reveal uncomfortable truths we were too frightened to admit, and they offer a profound opportunity for foundational change. Yet, ego frequently causes the initial crash and then stubbornly blocks the subsequent recovery. Ernest Hemingway captured this perfectly, noting that while the world breaks everyone, many grow stronger at the broken places. However, those who refuse to break are simply killed. When confronted with our own failures or exposure, like Lance Armstrong desperately ruining other people's lives to deny his own cheating, the ego's instinct is to double down, escalate, and aggressively protect its fragile self-esteem. True recovery requires suppressing this instinct, absorbing the painful spotlight, and utilizing the ruin as a catalyst to strip away the deception, leaving only the authentic self ready to rebuild. Draw the line. When John DeLorean's automotive empire began to collapse due to his own narcissism and severe mismanagement, his response was not a sober reflection on his errors. Instead, he attempted to salvage his failing company through an illegal $60 million cocaine deal. He dug himself into a hole and refused to stop until he reached the absolute bottom. Risk and failure are inherent components of any ambitious undertaking, but when a person's entire identity becomes inextricably tethered to their work, admitting a mistake feels tantamount to personal destruction. Ego triggers a primal panic, urging the individual to throw good money after bad, initiate desperate cover-ups, and escalate conflicts simply to avoid the appearance of weakness. Conversely, true strength is demonstrated in the ability to accept a loss and make a full stop. When Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, a dismissal he entirely brought upon himself through his uncontrollable ego, he did not engage in a permanent destructive war of attrition. He absorbed the agonizing blow, started new ventures like Pixar, and matured significantly before his eventual return. Others, like the founder of American Apparel, chose to wage ruinous, scorched earth campaigns against their own companies rather than accept a diminished role or take responsibility for their scandals. Alexander Hamilton wisely advised that when facing an inescapable predicament of one's own making, one must act with fortitude and possess the courage to completely stop. Failure is an inevitable occurrence in the cycle of aspiration and success. Allowing ego to transform a temporary defeat into a permanent, character-destroying catastrophe is a completely optional tragedy. Maintain your own scorecard. In the year 2000, the New England Patriots used a late-round draft pick to select an overlooked quarterback named Tom Brady. He would go on to become one of the most successful players in the history of the sport, delivering an unimaginable return on investment. Yet, the Patriots' front office did not view this unprecedented success purely as a victory to be celebrated. Instead, they were deeply critical of their own scouting process, recognizing that they had fundamentally miscalculated his potential and allowed a franchise-altering talent to linger until the 6th round. Even though the outcome was a spectacular triumph, they held themselves to a standard that superseded the final score. This is the defining characteristic of greatness, evaluating oneself not against the external applause or the objective markers of societal success, but against an uncompromising internal metric of absolute potential. As Warren Buffett distinguishes, it is the difference between an external scorecard and an internal one. When ego is removed, the fickle opinions of others lose their weight. The philosopher Adam Smith suggested that we should judge our actions through the lens of an indifferent spectator, avoiding the groundless validation that society readily dispenses. Relying on an internal standard prevents the moral compromises and lazy justifications that arise when we simply try to get away with what is permissible. It demands a rigorous, continuous pursuit of genuine improvement, completely independent of whether the world is currently cheering or booing. Always love. When a young Orson Welles directed Citizen Kane, he crafted a cinematic masterpiece that loosely fictionalized the life of media baron William Randolph Hearst. Despite his immense wealth and power, Hearst became entirely consumed by a malicious campaign to destroy the film and its creator. He leveraged his vast network of newspapers, threatened theater chains, and even utilized the FBI to suppress the picture. In his desperate, ego-driven attempt to control his image, Hearst ultimately cemented his legacy as a reviled tyrant, proving the paradox of hate. Attempting to destroy something out of bitterness often ensures its permanent preservation. The higher one ascends, the more targets and perceived slights will present themselves. Ego views every challenge or insult as a war requiring total retaliation, squandering massive amounts of energy and time attempting to force the world into compliance. The infinitely more powerful response to an attack is love, or at the very least, empathetic indifference. When Richard Nixon was exiled from the presidency, it was his lifelong, hateful perception of a hostile world that ultimately destroyed him. Conversely, figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass recognized that hate acts as a corrosive acid, destroying the vessel that contains it far more than the target it is directed toward. Choosing to obsess over past wrongs, much like a rejected band member who spends decades nursing a grudge despite achieving massive, independent success, is a self-imposed prison. Empathy, forgiveness, and love offer the only sustainable freedom, allowing a person to continue their work untainted by the destructive, paralyzing poison of resentment for everything that comes next. Ego is the enemy. During the darkest years of the 20th century, Winston Churchill stood essentially alone against the rising tide of fascism, facing isolation and overwhelming adversity before eventually securing a monumental victory. Katharine Graham similarly stood alone as she navigated a crucible of corporate crises to protect her family's legacy. These historical trials confirm a fundamental reality. The path to any significant achievement guarantees a harsh encounter with difficulty. As Benjamin Franklin observed, those who drink deeply from the cup of life must expect to swallow some of the bitter dregs at the bottom. The crucial variable in surviving these inevitable setbacks is the absence of ego. The journey is an endless, cyclical loop. Aspiration leads to success, which inevitably breeds adversity, which then demands new aspiration. In every single phase, ego actively works to undermine the process. It poisons ambition, turns success into a fragile delusion, and transforms temporary failure into a permanent, catastrophic collapse. The true objective is not merely to acquire wealth, power, or historical recognition, but to forge a disciplined, balanced, and resilient character. Stripping away the toxic layers of self-absorption allows one to face the unknown future with quiet strength, fully prepared to sweep the floor clean every single day and then begin the grueling, beautiful work all over again. Epilogue. Confronting the internal adversary of ego is an arduous and uncomfortable undertaking. It requires the willingness to face the darker aspects of one's psyche and dismantle the comforting illusions that falsely elevate self-worth. It is entirely a daily, unending practice. Just as a floor swept completely clean today will inevitably gather dust by tomorrow, the ego continuously creeps back, requiring constant, vigilant maintenance. The devastating consequences of neglecting this daily sweeping are visible in the tragic demises of once brilliant individuals who allowed their unmanaged vanity to eat them alive from the inside, confusing the loss of status with the loss of life itself. The grand illusion of ambition is the belief that our lives are meant to be immortal monuments and that failure to achieve supreme dominance renders our existence worthless. This immense, self-imposed pressure cracks the foundation of the mind. While striving for monumental achievements in business, art, or public service is a noble pursuit, it must be decoupled from the disease of self-importance. Perfecting the personal character, cultivating humility, resilience, and genuine purpose is the only reliable foundation for professional endurance. The choice remains a constant daily requirement across every phase of the journey. To aspire without ego, to succeed without ego, and to push through failure with unbreakable strength rather than fragile pride.